You don't have to believe the stories on my blog. You can dismiss them as good hallucinations or bad fiction if you want to, but they're all true. The darkness was never empty. There are things that wait for the innocent and unwary to turn their backs. What is it you think I'm talking about here? Ghosts? Vampires? Ghouls? If only it were that simple. The creatures of the night are still out there, but they're not shadowing your every footstep. They just check your status updates from the comfort of their tombs. All I ever wanted was to be a do-it-yourself style reporter, but more often than I like, I find myself becoming part of my stories. It turns out gods and monsters don't like their secrets getting out any more than your standard politician or celebrity. We all know how this is going to turn out in the end. I'm already long overdue for jail, the loony bin, or a guest of honor spot at a monster buffet. But until that fateful day, I'm not going to back down or give up. My name is Brian Foster, and some people call me the Night Blogger. The Night Blogger, The Graveyard Game and Other Cemetery Plots, Part 3. The House of Gorgo, The Parliament of Moloch, Under the Eye of Luna. October 7th. I should mention that the same text file that gave me the addresses of the 3 temples also included a way to properly defile them. Apparently splashing shrines with good old-fashioned holy water or smashing statues isn't good enough anymore. Thankfully, I knew a guy that spent a lot of time on Craigslist, so I was able to find some pages of the apocryphal Book of Tobit. The Catskill Game Farm was the closest thing Albany had to a zoo. It wasn't a big place, and certainly couldn't compete with what they had downstate, but it had a certain rustic charm. It wasn't quite a wildlife refuge, and wasn't quite a farm, but when I was growing up, I'd really loved visiting the place. In 2006, due to mounting financial pressures, the Catskill Game Farm had shut down. The elephants, ostriches, and lizards were sold off at auction. Even the merry-go-round went to the highest bidder. The buildings are still standing. They're surrounded by a 10-foot chain-link fence and marked with large signs of the no trespassing variety. But things like that aren't going to stop curious kids, diabolical cultists, and idiots like me. Shortly after sunset, I climbed the fence, only tearing my shirt twice in the process. Once I was in, I took a moment to snap a few pictures with my iPhone. Click. Abandoned buildings, farmhouses mostly, empty livestock pens and concession stands that have begun to lean with age and neglect. Every doorway and window has been boarded up. How long had it been since I was last here? At least a decade. That and the pitch blackness left me wandering around for almost half an hour, but finally I found what I was looking for. Click, the domed reptile house, designed to look like a turtle shell. The entranceway isn't blocked off, and strange graffiti surrounds it. Right. I fished the pen light out of my carry-all bag. Now I would find out if the information I'd gotten was true, or if I'd gotten roofied by the devil for nothing. The darkness closed in around me. With every step into the reptile house, my pen light became more and more useless. Then it went out. A rational person might blame the pen light's failure on a bad battery, but my world had stopped being rational the day my mother had died. Thankfully, I had brought a lighter as well. I flicked it on and kept walking. The floor sloped downwards. There are empty glass cages on either side of me. The odor of reptiles still lingered faintly in the air. When I turned the corner, I saw the altar of Gorgo. Some enterprising cultists had turned the information kiosk into a chapel. There was a statue on the stand's counter. I wasn't sure how it would come out, but I tried to get a picture of it. The idol was about 18 inches tall. It represented a woman with her arms spread wide. A halo of serpent-like shapes radiated out from her head. Hello, Gorgo. I started for the kiosk when I felt something soft underfoot. My skin began to crawl. I swung my lighter around to see what I was walking through. It was snakes. The entire altar of Gorgo was surrounded by snakes. Once I'd finished running and gotten the incoherent blubbering out of my system, I forced myself to go back there. Sarah was counting on me. The carpet of snakes around the kiosk was about 3 feet wide and ankle deep. It was also perfectly still and silent. Not a wriggle or a hiss anywhere. Closer and careful examination revealed that these snakes were all dead. Dead and cruelly taxidermied. Their bellies had been stuffed with sawdust and sewn shut with fishing line. Mismatched buttons had been fastened over the empty eye sockets. It looked to me like the worshippers of Gorgo sure had a lot of free time on their hands. I kicked my way through the dead reptiles until I reached the altar. I tried to take another picture of the thing, but I still wasn't too sure about the lighting. Then I got to work. I had a page from the apocryphal Book of Tobit in my jacket pocket. It was an old piece of parchment, a copy of a copy of a copy, but still over 500 years old. Still old enough to do the trick. I picked up the statue of Gorgo. It was cool to the touch, then set it back down on top of the parchment. I crossed my fingers and set the page from the apocryphal Book of Tobit on fire. It burned easily, giving off a foul-smelling smoke. I watched the statue, carefully wondering what might happen. Would it bleed? Would it burst into flames? Would it melt like wax? I started fiddling with my iPhone again, wondering if I could get this on video. There was a rustling sound behind me. Something soft brushed across my foot. The snakes were moving. All of them. I said, "Oh, fuck." Once the idol was gone, the zombie snakes were still. Once my knees had stopped quivering, I got up and got the hell out of there. Back at my apartment, Sarah was waiting up for me. She didn't ask how things had gone. She was just happy I'd returned at all. We put on some trash TV, sat together, and didn't talk. 1 down, 2 to go. Hopefully the worst was behind me. Hopefully. October 16th. 3 pepper sprayings and an arrest later, I realized there was no way I could get to the Temple of Mormo myself. Part of me wanted to call Ashley Fowler and give her a piece of my mind. Between this and the Night of the Living Dead Snakes, I was starting to suspect she was trying to sandbag me. The Temple of Mormo was somewhere in Charity House, a woman's shelter, which is why my attempts to visit, and then my later attempts to break in, were met with such hostility. So, in the end, I had no choice. I sent Sarah.
My name is Sarah Bishop, but if you've been following along, you must already know that. Something else I want you to know. Brian didn't make me do this any more than he made me play the graveyard game. I volunteered for all of it. Like Brian said, we didn't have much choice in the matter. There's this presence in my head. It's buried now, but I can feel it digging to the surface. If we don't hurry, it will be me, and I won't be anything. It wasn't too hard for me to get admitted to Charity House. I've had more than my share of bad relationships. All I did was put them into one guy and exaggerate a little. There was something about Charity House that reminded me of junior high. It was the tiled hallways and the thick wooden doors. The woman in charge of the place was named Claudia. There was a tattoo of an owl on her neck. They gave me a room and told me the rules. No drugs or alcohol, no visitors, and mandatory counseling sessions. Mealtimes were at 9, noon, and 7. I spent the day getting settled and mingling. The staff were either my age or my mom's. I started to feel guilty about what I was doing. I felt like I was taking advantage of people, just trying to do some good. It wasn't until dinner time that I started to notice that all the staff had owl tattoos. Most had them on their arms, but one girl had hers right behind her left ear. I almost didn't see it. That reminded me of something from my women's studies class. The owl was supposed to be the symbol of the goddess Minerva. I didn't just wait until lights out. I waited until 2 a.m. before I started exploring. The whole time I laid there in that single bed, biding my time, I kept wondering, what had I gotten myself into? And what had I let get into me? Whatever it was, I'd rather die than let it take over. Creeping through the hallways, I held tight to the things Brian had given me. A box of wooden matches and a page from the apocryphal book of Tobit. He told me to search places like the basement and the boiler room, but for some reason I thought I'd have better luck if I checked the roof. The climb up the stairwell was nerve-wracking. Every step I made seemed twice as loud as it should have been, and it was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with fall. This was more brutal, like a February snowstorm. I was wearing a hoodie, but I was still shivering. There was frost on the handrails, and I could see my breath. The doorway to the roof was blocked off by a card table with a blanket thrown over it. It didn't look like much of an altar, but the statue in the center of the table looked like the real deal. I wasn't surprised to see it was an owl. But it was the cruelest-looking owl I had ever seen. Everything about it looked sharp. The beak, the claws, even the ridges of its feathers. The eyes were little black gems that held a light of their own. It looked like it was made from brass. I sure didn't think it could ever burn, but I did just what Brian told me. I put the page under the statue and lit it. It might have looked like metal, but it melted like it was made from ice. A few minutes was all it took. Once I was sure it was gone, I started to head back down the stairs. Claudia and the other women of Charity House were waiting for me. If this had been a movie, they would have attacked me right then and there, torn me limb from limb. But they just stared at me with these weird little smiles. I think I might have stood there all night, too afraid to move or even speak. But then they all turned and went back the way they'd come. Only Claudia waited behind. There was nothing else to do. I walked past her thinking any moment she would pull out a knife and stab me in the back, but all she did was whisper, "I know what you are." And then she was gone too. And I ran for my life.
I guess I should tell you that the owl isn't just sacred to Minerva. It is also the symbol of a demon god called Moloch. And I bet you wouldn't be surprised to learn that the female aspect of Moloch is called Mormo. Moloch again. Just what I needed. None of this feels right. Don't get me wrong. I'm glad they didn't hurt her. More glad than Sarah will ever know. But why didn't they? What are they planning? Is any of this really going to do any good? Only one more temple to get rid of then, and I guess I'll know. Of course, this one is going to be a little different. Ashley Fowler left me a special note about it. Bring kerosene. Great. Just great. October 23rd. I found any excuse I could to delay my final confrontation with the forces of evil. And why not? Sarah's nightmares and sleepwalking had stopped. It was funny, but despite the weird way our relationship had begun, she and I were having great times together, both in and out of bed. We even managed to see a movie without any supernatural incursions, or, worse yet, people talking on their cell phones. Then today happened. Today I came home to find Sarah's suicide note taped to the door. All things considered, I got lucky. She was unconscious, but alive. After the ambulance stabilized her and took her away, I went to the hardware store and bought a container of kerosene. I may have mentioned before that I do not like the smell of junkyards. The swampy, rusty, oily air always leaves me feeling dizzy. The junkyard known as Keller & Sons was no better than any of the rest. In fact, it smelled a little worse than your average scrapyard. There was an undercurrent of something like week-old roadkill. The odor made those far-fetched rumors of this place being a dumping ground for the mobsters of Mechanicville seem suddenly plausible. My skills at fence climbing didn't fail me, and soon I was wandering along the muddy paths that wove through the stripped, ruined cars, tall piles of old tires, and dormant heavy machinery. The moon was waxing and gibbous. Everything was quiet save for the occasional hooting of an owl. I had my penlight in one hand, the can of kerosene in the other, and my trusty carry-all man purse slung over one shoulder. I also had no idea how I always seemed to end up in places like this at night. The partial reason was that I didn't think Keller or his sons would take kindly to my asking if I could hunt down the demon god hiding on their property and maybe set it on fire. The other reason is that it seems that creeping around in the dark is my lot in life. Cold mud squelched around my feet and seeped into my sneakers. I moved as quietly as I could and only flicked on my penlight when I had to. It didn't matter, though. I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. I thought of Sarah's chant of Gorgo, Mormo, Luna, thousand-faced moon, and looked up into the sky. You didn't have to be a student of the occult to know that Luna meant the moon. Is that what was watching me? The idea left a crawling sensation in my stomach, but I pressed on. Finally, I found what I was looking for. An old municipal bus. It had no tires or engine, and the windows had been painted black. I flicked on my penlight and wasn't surprised to see its markings named at number 55. Was this somehow the same bus prowling the streets of Albany? The frontmost double doors were practically welded shut, but the rear exit doors opened easily. The first thing I noticed was that the sickening, rotten smell had gotten stronger. Then I realized that the bus was occupied. One sweep of my penlight, and a terrified sob later, I saw that the figures in the seats were perfectly still. They were corpses. They were completely desiccated and only sat up because they had been tied into their seats. Their faces had been made up with black and white grease paint. I entered the bus, trying not to think of those damn zombie snakes from before. The altar of Luna was up at the front of the bus, on top of the gutted dashboard. I had to make my way through row after row of mummified clowns to get to it. With every step I took, the crawling sensation moved further from my stomach to my balls. Were these the things that had ruined my first date with Sarah? I suppose they had to be. I opened the can of kerosene and started splashing it around. Who had these people been? Had they volunteered for this, or had they been drafted, shall we say? Once I was out of kerosene, I made my way back to the idol of Luna. It was a sphere of finely polished black stone. For a crazy moment, I wondered if it was a moon rock. Then the vehicle's front doors crashed open, and Mr. Jack stepped calmly onto the first step. His knife was in his hand. He said,
"Hasn't anyone ever told you to respect other people's property?"
"Stay back!"
I shouted.
"Or I'll...
He grinned his ugly clown grin.
"You'll what?"
Since actions speak louder than words, I threw the empty kerosene can at his head. It bounced off his face with a hollow clang. Then I was backpedaling, not wanting to take my eyes off him as I rummaged around in my carry-all. Finally, my fingers closed around the brittle page of the apocryphal Book of Tobit. Mr. Jack shouted and came at me. He was screaming and laughing all at once. Almost at the rear exit, I flung my penlight at his head and missed. With my free hand, I found the lighter, lit up the page, and dropped it into the nearest puddle of kerosene. A second later, a sheet of flame engulfed the seats, the mummies, and Mr. Jack himself. My sneakers caught fire as well, but a convenient mud puddle kept me from having to go to the emergency room. Or the shoe store. Considering the amount of improperly stored motor oil, the possibility that Mr. Jack had escaped the conflagration, and that I already had one court date looming ahead of me, fleeing the scene seemed like a good idea. I couldn't wait to tell Sarah that the mission was accomplished, that everything was going to be all right. I'd already gotten halfway back to my apartment when I remembered that she wasn't there.
The Night Blogger was written and produced by Al Bruno III, with production assistance by Brian Mancy. The voice of the Night Blogger was Brian Mancy. The voice of Sarah Bishop was Amber DeLima. Music was by Josh Bruno. For more internet tomfoolery, stop by albruno3.blogspot.com. And while you're there, why not consider clicking the donate button? Thank you.